We can chit chat.
Yay. So did you adopt your cats or where did you get them?
Yeah, I adopted them as kittens though because I wanted to get two, and so I like bonded them. So essentially, I adopted them
Oh.
from two different places on the same day, and then just like put them together.
And
And
you're like,
then
you are now
I'm
siblings.
like, you are now brothers because I knew I was going to be traveling, and I didn't want one to be lonely. And so the idea is
Oh, smart.
as long as they have each other, um, like they can't really be lonely because I'm just like auxiliary to their experience. Like I'll pull up a picture for those who are filtering in. We're discussing my kittens, and it is just about what it sounds like. And these are the two kittens, and they just like need to have each other. And so this way, when I travel for work, like they have a pet sitters, obviously professional pet sitters, but they don't feel any trauma because like they have each other. So they kind of like care a lot more about each other's presence than they do about mine
Oh,
being there.
that's so cute.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're just gonna wait another minute or two to let everyone get in the room.
Awesome. And San Mateo, is that California?
Yes, we are in the Bay Area.
Awesome. I grew up in the Bay Area.
Wow.
Well, I
Where in
grew
the
up
Bay Area?
between San Jose and Nashville, Tennessee. So San Jose,
Oh,
California and
wow.
Nashville, Tennessee, back and forth. It was very strange. I had a tech dad. So always
Cool.
moving.
Oh, it looks like someone's joining us all the way from India. That's awesome.
Amazing.
Where else is everyone signing in from?
Yeah, let us know. I'm in Edinburgh, Scotland, where the sun is just starting to set. We get really long days here in the summer. It'll like stay light until midnight in the summer. Oh my
Nice.
goodness. Argentina,
Argentina,
Newfoundland,
Newfoundland, Paris.
Chile,
Wow.
France. Yay, France. That's where my family lives. Wow, Poland, Jamaica, England. See?
Jamaica.
This is
Your
amazing. This is my
fans are
favorite
from all
thing.
over.
This is my favorite thing about doing virtual events is like you can truly like break down any geographic boundary.
Yes, I think it's definitely one of the
Making me
positives that came out.
it's making me wish I had brushed my hair. I was like, I don't know how to brush my hair. And now I'm wishing I brushed my hair. Um, if anybody posts on social, just like filter. Can you just like filter?
Oh, someone's from Ireland. Awesome. New
Oh,
York
close.
City, San Mateo.
Wow. Amazing. Amazing. Let's see. All right. Love the weather in Edinburgh. The weather in Edinburgh is amazing today. I was actually just on the beach with a cocktail and a book. I'm rereading The
Wow.
Count of Monte Cristo right now, which is a hefty undertaking. It's currently supporting my laptop, or else I would pick it up and show. But the edition I have is about this long,
Nice.
and so it's taking a lot of time to go through it. Aw.
Yes, I agree.
All right.
All
Do you
right,
think we should
let's
get
get
started?
started. Yeah.
Awesome.
So, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Cherry, and I'm a librarian with the San Mateo County Libraries. I'm so excited to be in conversation with V.E. Schwab to discuss their newest book, Gallant, before they take questions from the audience. Join us next Wednesday, May 18th at 6 p.m. for S. Bear Bergman's Special Topics in Being a Human, as he discusses his book and shares live advice with the audience. Your microphone and video will be turned off, but please feel free to use the chat and submit your questions in the Zoom Q&A. For those who'd like access to live closed captions for this event, please click on CC, then Show Subtitle. San Mateo County Libraries welcomes Victoria V.E. Schwab, a #1 New York Times bestselling author of more than 20 books, including The Shades of Magic, The Villains, the Cassidy Blake series, and the international bestseller, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. Their work has received critical acclaim, and First Kill, based on Schwab's short story, is currently in the works for a Netflix adaptation. Thank you for joining us all the way from Scotland, V. Schwab. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, First Kill, is like, it comes out on June 10th, my first TV show on Netflix. So that starts to seem very, very fast, very, very soon.
Yeah, that's next month. So
Yeah.
exciting.
It's very soon. It's very soon. But yeah, and I know that like even though we're here to chat about Gallant, like people can ask questions about anything that they like in the Q&A. As you said so nicely in my introduction, I have written more than 20 books. There's a lot of different fandoms, and I'm always happy to answer questions about any of them.
Yes. And that brings us to my first question, which is for those who haven't read Gallant yet, can you maybe talk a bit about what it's about?
Of course, of course. So Gallant, which is my latest book release, is a standalone novel, and I like to say that it's The Secret Garden meets Crimson Peak. That's the short, like one line. The slightly longer version is that Gallant is about a teenage girl named Olivia Pryor who has spent the vast majority of her life in an orphanage called Maryland School with no knowledge of her family except for a journal that she was found with. The journal seems to have entries from her mother that devolve over time into madness and illustrations that make very little sense. But there's a letter in the back of the journal that is perfectly lucid from her mother to Olivia that warns her she will be safe so long as she stays away from Gallant. And for years, Olivia has no idea what this means. Gallant is just a word out of a context until one day at the orphanage, she receives a letter from an uncle she's never met, inviting her to come home to the family estate, which is called Gallant. Olivia goes and arrives to discover no uncle, a house falling into disrepair, a garden being strangled by strange dead weeds, and a wall with a locked door that seems to lead nowhere. And that is basically the introduction to Gallant.
And it is definitely so amazing. I like when I read it, it's so easy to get lost into because of the way like your writing style. It's just so vivid and descriptive that you just fall into the story.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. That was the goal. I mean, it's my background is in poetry, and I think that I try these days to find different ways to infuse the poetry into my prose. And it takes a different shape in every book. With Addie LaRue, it's in the actual cadence of the narration so that it feels like an oral tale. With like the Our Dark Duet, which is the second book in the Monsters of Verity series, there's a monster's point of view, which is like in free verse poetry. And in Gallant, there are these journal entries. And the thing about poetry is that poetry without teeth, really, without you figuring out a way to latch onto it, almost reads like madness. So essentially, when I was writing these entries from Olivia's mother, I wrote them as poems, knowing that if you weren't reading them as poems, they would read kind of like somebody losing their mind.
Yeah, I love that. I think that was definitely like you could definitely feel that as a reader. And then like, Olivia growing up and trying to kind of figure out what like her mother is trying to tell her, and
Yeah.
coupled with the really beautiful illustrations in the book, I think it's just like a different type of art form. Can you tell us about the how you like what was the process working with an illustrator to kind of match the
Yeah. It was so basically a lot of books have illustrations, right? You have comics and graphic novels, which depend like majority on the illustrations. You have chapter books, and you also have like books for younger readers for whom the illustrations are supplementary. They're additive, but they're not essential, right? Maybe they're like at the beginnings of the chapters, or maybe they're dispersed throughout to just kind of augment the experience. But the illustrations in Gallant are not supplementary. They are absolutely integral to the story. And that was actually really scary, as I knew I wanted that. And yet this is not a book for young readers. It's actually my first all ages read, which is we can talk about afterward because I feel like that's its own topic. But I don't want to lose track of the illustration part, which is to say that I knew going in that this book had to have these illustrations in order for the story that I wanted to write to make sense. And that was really scary because it meant handing over a piece of the creative narrative to somebody else. And that made it a kind of creative trust fall. So I knew there were going to be 8 illustrations. They are integral to the plot of the story. They are their own mystery for the reader and Olivia to unpick. And so essentially what I did was I wrote 8 didactics. I essentially You know, like, and you'll see a lot of people do this on Instagram, which is a great accessibility tool, which is they will essentially write a description of what the picture is for those who can't see the picture. I
Yes.
did that 8 times.
Oh,
So for
wow.
each work of art, I wrote a description and I titled it and everything as if I were providing the written description of somebody else's visual work of art, even though the art didn't exist yet. And so that's how I was able to like almost retcon, but it's still then those 8 pieces of description went to an artist who then created the works of art I was describing. And so one of the scariest creative moments was getting that email with the sketches to see if we were on the right track. And it was such an incredible relief because there's really no way I would have had to unpick the entire narrative if the illustrations hadn't been possible. There are really 2 things I started out with when I was talking to my editor. I said, I want this book to have illustrations. Is that possible? You know, is it in the budget? Is it in the timeline? And I also knew that I needed to tell the story in 3rd person narration, not 1st person narration, because Olivia, the main character, is nonverbal.
Mhm.
And I knew, given my profile, that the book would have an audiobook. And I knew that if I had an audiobook with a 1st person narration, then an actual voice would supplant Olivia's voice, somebody who doesn't have a spoken voice. And so there were decisions that were made really early on, and the illustrations were absolutely one of those. And it was really, really scary, but it was so satisfying to see it work in the end.
Wow, that's such an amazing process. And I love that, you know, you took like an accessibility tool and like really like used it to your advantage to kind of get that what your vision was across. Was there a
Yeah.
lot of back and forth between you and the illustrator?
There wasn't, there was a lot of work that went into selecting the right illustrator. And I think that's the issue, is that like there had to be a lot of trust at the beginning. So there was more time that went into selecting who was going to adapt it.
Oh, wow.
But once we had the illustrator, it really did need to be a trust scenario. Illustrators' times are incredibly precious. This isn't someone who can just go back and forth on a lot of things. And so I saw the sketches and I knew we were on the right path. And so I was able to give a couple small notes on the sketches. And then the next thing I saw was the full illustrations.
Okay, awesome. And
Yeah.
someone looks like they did ask who was the illustrator.
Oh, Manuel Sambarek, who I believe is Croatian and also is on Instagram, and his work is incredible. He's like one of those artists that I just want to get tattoos of all of his work. And also what I love is that his general work is very different from the work inside Gallant. And so it's exciting to see the full kind of breadth and range of an artist. But yeah, he's a brilliant, brilliant illustrator.
Wow. Also, someone asked in our questions, is Gallant going to be part of a series?
Right now it's a standalone. I think I could see it being part of a collection that is companion based, something that shares the world or the aura or the energy and the tone. But I'm not sure that I want to do more with Olivia and Matthew. Mostly just because I really like standalones. They give me something very different than my series do. I write both, like The Near Witch, The Invisible Life of Addie, LaRue, and Gallant are all standalones, whereas Shades of Magic and Vicious, obviously, and I have a couple duologies, so like Savage Song, Cassidy Blake. Like most of the time I write series. So when I write standalone, I do it for a reason, not because I don't think there's more story to tell within the world.
Okay. Yes. Speaking of Addie LaRue, someone did ask if they will ever show up in another story.
Ah, probably not. No, the question I get asked most often and the question I'm most ornery about, no offense to that question asker, it's not your fault that I hear it like 300 times, is that whether Addie will have a sequel, and it won't. If anyone were to show up in someone else's story, it would probably be Luke, not Addie, just because of the nature of his position and identity. And because I'm really interested in exploring the pantheon that Luke comes from, because it's suggested that he's one of several gods in a pantheon. And it
Ooh.
makes me wonder what those other gods are and what their stories are. But I was really intentional about ending Addie where I wanted to end Addie. And again, I think this is because I write series as well. There's this sense of like, oh, well, you can always write more. But the trick with a standalone novel is that you want the reader to want more because they like the story, but not need more because they didn't understand the story. And I think I try really hard to walk that line as somebody who really enjoys open endings. I think it's that the way I always describe this is, writers, when they write you a story, it's like writing you a house. And some writers give you the keys to the house and they let you go into the house and they let you look around and explore every nook and cranny and crevice and hallway. And I write you a house, and then for a little while, for the duration of the story, I part the window curtains in the house and I let you look in. But then at the end of the story, I close the curtains and you have to walk on, and the people are still in the house. They still exist. They still live. Their lives go on because we want you to believe that they're people, not fictional characters. And so, of course, their story goes on, but you're no longer privy to the next chapter. What I've chosen to write you is one chapter in their life.
Wow, I think that really, like, having read multiple of your books and works, I think that definitely captures the feeling, because after, I read like A Darker Shade of Magic and like just like, because you want more from the story, but also it's like, okay, now it's time to move on and like get on with my life.
With Shades of Magic, there is more, which is, so there are 3 more books in the Shades of Magic series, the next arc being Threads of Power. And that was one of those ones where I got halfway through the 3rd book in Conjuring of Light and realized that I wasn't done. But it's also hard because, again, like, I write my stories backwards, so I know my endings first. So by the time I actually start writing a novel, I know exactly how it ends. And then that's the thing I'm working toward. And 22 books in, I've rewritten entire books from scratch, but I've not rewritten endings. Like, all of my endings have stayed. And so I was a bit thrown. I got halfway through Conjuring of Light, which is the 3rd Shades of Magic book, for anyone who doesn't know. And Maris, who runs a forbidden ship, essentially a floating market, makes a deal with Delilah Bard and says that she'll call in a favor. And I realized that that favor was not going to get called in this book. And I had this moment of like, crap, because like I was going to end it at 3. And then I was like, but there's a favor outstanding. And so I got halfway through and I called my editor and I was like, so like, I have a problem. And then, even still, the reason it's called Threads of Power and not Shades of Magic is we have the whole cast of Shades of Magic, but I'm introducing new characters. And so I had to sit down and think, what is my new ending for my new characters, and work backwards from there, because I don't just like write into the dark.
That's awesome. And also a very good tip.
But I do think that's the big difference with standalone versus series, and why it can sometimes feel like when a writer stops at a standalone, well, that they could just keep going. But for those of us who write backwards from the ending, when we're writing a standalone, that truly is an intentional stopping point. Like in Gallant, not to spoil anything, but hopefully to plant this seed in anyone's mind who hasn't read it, the very last image in the book, I had that, and then I went and I wrote the rest of the book. So like the last scene, it's take place with a piano. Like there's a moment on the very last page. I had that image in my mind when I went and wrote the entire rest of the book. Because for me, an ending, it's technically the ending. It's also a culmination. It's a promise being fulfilled. It's everything you're working toward. And I want everything to have this force so that when you land at the punctuation mark at that last page, you feel earned. Like the story should feel earned. The characters should feel earned. Their ending should feel earned. And so that's why I work with that in mind. And so there is an intentionality, and I think that makes it harder for me to pry that door back open. And that's why I say things like maybe another story in the same vein, in the same world. But like for Olivia and Matthew, I knew exactly what that ending point looked like.
Wow. That like makes me want to just go back and just like read that last part, because I can definitely picture, but just kind of like looking at that moment and like thinking about all the events that kind of like spirals out. And someone did ask a question about writing the book backwards. Does it help you to include Easter eggs?
Easter eggs meaning like things along the way that are like, because Easter eggs normally means like stories, hints from within other stories, or like little teasers. I don't necessarily, those don't go into the first draft for me. Those are things that go in later along the way. For me, a first draft is truly laying out. I've used a court, I'll use a lot of metaphors in this talk. I'm sorry, I love metaphors, but I use a corpse metaphor, which is like a first draft is you building the bones. A second draft is like the muscle and tissue. And then the third draft is the skin, and the fourth is like the clothes and the makeup. And so I definitely don't necessarily even think of themes and motifs and all of the little Easter eggs and hints and twists when I'm writing a first draft. I wish I could think of all of them, but I really just like am trying to word vomit the story out in a way that excites me. To be very frank, one of the reasons that I write the ending first is because writing books is incredibly hard. And I think that the vast majority of people who start writing a novel quit, and I don't blame them. So I'm always looking for ways to keep myself from quitting. And the way that I found is most important to keep myself from quitting is to have an ending that I'm really excited about, because then on good days, I'm looking forward to sitting down and working. And on bad days, I know that I won't quit because it's just a measurable distance between me and the end. And if you do get stuck, you can say, okay, well, here's where I am in the story, and there's where the ending is. Well, that's a measurable distance, right? So like, what's one thing that can happen between here and there? And now I've found a plot. And then what's one thing that can happen between here and there? And so you can kind of create a breadcrumb trail. But I like don't do it to be a mastermind of the world. I do it because I'm like extremely anxious and I get overwhelmed easily by the work and by like the sheer scale of it. I didn't write a novel until like many years after I started writing. I wrote short fiction and script and poetry and all these different things. And I didn't think I was capable of writing a novel because it's an overwhelming task. And it still is 22 books in, an overwhelming task. So everything I do is in the interest of keeping me from quitting.
Oh, wow. Speaking of your craft, we do have a few questions about that. Someone asked, I have a few ideas that I want to write, but I can never choose which one to write at the moment. Do you have any advice on how to choose between ideas?
It's a really great question. I sigh heavily because I'm in that right now. I finished a novel and I have 4 things in front of me and I'm trying to decide. I keep like a 6-burner stove, right? Again, I told you the metaphors would be all over the place. A 6-burner stove, and I usually have one object on high heat and the other 5 are mulling, which means I always have options for what I'm going to write next. But that also means that when I take one thing off the heat entirely, I now have to decide. And I'm not gonna like, sometimes it's hard. I'm sitting here right now and I have the second book in Threads of Power, so the 5th book of the Shades of Magic series. I have the 3rd book in the Villain series, and I have something completely new. And I have to decide which of these things to do. And it's hard. And some of the times, like contracts and deadlines, if you're a professional author, help you because some things are expected. But I really go with the thing that is the most insistent, is the most annoyingly nagging. Like if I lie awake at night, which of the stories is the thing demanding to be written? And I don't mean that to sound as like at the service of the craft. What I mean by that is like, again, coming back to the fact that writing a novel is a long and arduous process, and your enthusiasm is going to be the only thing that sustains you. Because until that book is done, nobody else is on the sidelines cheering you on. Like it is a relationship between the writer and the page. And you don't have usually like a whole support system who's like rah-rahing you. And so the only thing that's going to sustain you for a month or 6 months or a year or 6 years, however long it takes to write the novel, is your excitement for the actual narrative. So picking the thing which is the most persistent is the thing that you're least likely to lose interest in along the way.
Wow, that's great advice.
Also, when in doubt, I just want to like dispel one rumor. First of all, there's no right way to write, but also when in doubt, you do not have to work on only one thing. I think the trick is to make sure you're not avoiding stories. So like you'll hear a lot of writers talk about shiny new ideas. It's usually a thing that happens. It's like a proven concept. If you get like 50 to 100 pages into a novel that you're writing, you will get a shiny new idea. And that shiny new idea will tell you, stop writing the thing that you're writing and go write this instead. The reason this happens is because the farther into a novel draft you get, the more the shine wears off. It's not mysterious to you anymore. It's an ordeal. And this thing over here, the shiny new idea, is promising you that it's not going to be an ordeal, but it's just going to repeat the process. It's just like, so once I get a certain amount into a story, I don't let myself like opt out and go work on something else, because that's a good way to finish nothing. But when you're in the first couple weeks, like let yourself jump back and forth between ideas and see which one kind of like wants the attention the most.
Wow, that's great. We also got another question that's like in a similar vein of, could you share other practices you have for not quitting and how you keep yourself going when writing a novel? And then I'm also going to throw in dealing with imposter syndrome in your writing routine.
Oh my God, could do an entire class just on that. So here's the thing, again, coming back to being a very anxious and neurotic person, what I need to do personally, and I can only speak to like my personal experience. I have a series that's available on YouTube called No Right Way. It's also available as a podcast. It's basically just me sitting down with other very successful writers who have vastly different processes than I do. And like, just so that you can see that like, I'm going to tell you what works for me, and someone else is going to have the exact opposite answer for you. So figuring out what works for you is important. For me, I need to break the work down into the smallest bite possible. Like, because again, book, overwhelming. I need to sit down and not try to write a chapter or even a scene. I sit down and think like, let's write a sentence. Let's write a moment. Let's write a paragraph. Let's get into that. And so I do this. I made a decision several years ago to measure my work in time instead of words. You know, you'll look at like NaNoWriMo or something like, which happens in November, which is where you try to write 50,000 words in a month. That is one good way to do it. However, if you're like me, you can start to become really obsessive about getting words down, not about getting the right words down. I would rather spend a few hours and get 500 words that I'm really proud of than 1,500 words, 500 of which are usable. And so what I found is that I like to do writing sprints. My writing sprints are short. They're like 15 minutes. I measure them. So I have this calendar. I'm not going to show you this month because this month is a travesty. But like last month, so I have a calendar. It's a habit tracker. So up here, there's like all different things I need to do. So there's like, and not all of them are writing based. This is the only part of my life that I'm organized in, Jenna. So not all of them are writing based. This is like, it has violin, it has exercise, it has all, but down here, these are all writing sprints. These are actually, each square is 30 minutes. So I have to do 2 times of my writing sprint to get one of those squares. But this is what I'm measuring, because I think it's extremely important to give yourself credit for the time that you spend thinking and staring and deleting and doing things wrong. Like, I think that when we measure words instead of time, we don't give ourselves credit for 90% of the process, which is not actively typing words on paper. So I think that's been probably the single biggest thing that I've done that has helped my writing process, is just like giving myself a little bit of grace and like giving myself a little bit of understanding that not every day is going to be a typing day. Some days are going to be daydreaming days. Some days I'm going to delete an entire chapter, and after I spent 5 hours looking at it, like a lot of times, I was talking with another writer about this today. A lot of writing is writing something wrong and then figuring out how to write it right. So if I only give myself credit for the end game words that I come up with, I'm not really paying attention to the whole process. And I think that it's a really easy way to get overwhelmed if you spend a week revising or deleting or rethinking. And so measuring time instead of words is probably like the biggest thing that I do.
That's such great advice.
Yeah.
Someone also asked, what do you think would be the most important pieces in world building for a story?
Ooh, okay. I grew up on anime, and so I follow the anime system of world building, as I like to call it. It's not an official thing, but basically, if you go and you watch an episode of an anime, the first episode preferably, the world building that you get is the world building that is relevant to the story. Like, anime is notorious for not giving you anything extraneous when you start it. Like, it drops you into that world, and everything you learn because it's relevant to the characters and the conflict. And it's like, you have to remember, especially if you write fantasy novels like I do, that you're not playing Sims. You're not just designing a world to design a world. You're designing a conflict and a story. That's the difference between like a Sims video game and your story. And so I often, when I'm looking at world building, I try and treat it as a thing which is attached to character. So for instance, in Shades of Magic, you have Kel and you have Lila. And Kel is born to Red London. So he is local to Red London. There is a lot that he is going to not notice about his world, that he's going to take for granted because it's all familiar to him. And then you have Lila, who is local to Grey London and comes into Red London. And I have scenes from both of their perspectives, third person, but both of their perspectives. Well, what those characters notice as they move through Red London is going to be completely different from each other. Kel is not going to notice the same things about his city that Lila is because this is her first time in it. So looking at the way your character moves through the world, what is familiar to them and what is unusual, and remembering that even if you're not inside that character's head the whole time, you're using their eyes. And so making sure, like when I'm looking at, okay, which aspects of a world am I going to focus on in Shades of Magic? It's going to be language and it's going to be clothing. I'm not going to design an 8-course banquet if my characters never eat, you know? But that's like the only, obviously my characters do eat, but like those are the things I think about. Language is super important because it's tied to station. So like it has a lot of inference that can be used and played with. Clothing is important. Interactions are important. So I look at like, okay, the night market, the stalls in the night market and the things that they sell are going to be the things which tell us about the world, because the night market is the thing both of my characters are going to move through. So just like look at your story and don't look at your world as like the game board that your story is set on. Look at the world that is like attached to your characters. It's like the water that your characters are swimming through. Like your characters are disrupting it. And so I always just think like when in doubt, just look at the pieces that we're going to be able to infer the rest of the world from. And they're usually really specific details.
I love this. I feel like I'm learning so much.
I know. I'm sorry. I warned you before we started that it would probably just become a craft talk.
No, I think people are loving it because there's lots of questions on that. And this one actually is about Shades of Magic.
Yeah.
They asked, your writing is always hauntingly beautiful, yet you manage to weave in lighthearted moments perfectly. One of the most hilarious moments in Shades of Magic is Alucard's, I don't know if I hope.
Yeah, I know I know exactly what moment
like,
they're talking about.
Stop effing with the ship.
Yeah, I'm on the ship.
What is your creative process for funny, lighthearted moments?
Yeah, for those who don't know, there's a moment, Kel and Lila are both elemental magicians. There's a moment where they are having some sexy times on a ship, and it is messing with the ship and the surrounding waters, and Alucard is the captain of that ship and not terribly happy with the scene. Here's the thing. I write really dark stuff. And I think that the most important thing when you're writing dark stories, whether it's action or thriller or horror or character, is to give those moments of levity, but not maybe for the reason you necessarily think about. A moment of levity is not just a reprieve. It's a moment where you get your readers to let down their guard. And so like you get the reader to exhale in that moment and like think that they're going to be okay. And then that allows you to like catch them unawares when the action happens again. Like I always warn readers, anytime you find yourself starting to laugh in my stories, someone's about to die. Because I want you to like, I want you to be relieved. I want you to sigh with relief in the moment when things are light so that you're unprepared for what happens next. You could also look at it the other way around as I want you to prepare yourself. But as the writer, I really look to those moments of levity to kind of like set the reader off balance. I also just think it's important because we hold our breath a lot under stress to make sure we have moments that force us to let it go. And also a reminder that these characters, again, are human. And like in the darkest moments, humans still seek lightness. We still seek moments where we can remind ourselves, my characters might be going through extraordinary things that it might be harder for you as the reader to relate to. And so humor also provides a moment for you to relate to them.
That's great. While we're still in the series, I am going to ask, who is your favorite character from A Darker Shade of Magic?
So rude. I try really hard not to play favorites just because someone once asked me the opposite version of that, which is that like, are there any characters that you hate? And it's like, I wouldn't write them then. Like, I don't have to like be on the side of all of my characters, but I want all of my characters to feel redeemable in some way, or else I wouldn't write someone that I didn't like writing, right?
Mhm.
That's not to say I don't have villains, because obviously I do. Shades of Magic. My favorite character arc was Holland, like very, very passionately. He was not the easiest character to write, but I felt very protective of his arc because I love to have a long con, and Holland is one of my long cons. And by that, I mean, I like to have a character that starts in one place in the reader's estimation. And then, like, obviously, every character needs to have an arc, but I specifically like to have a character that you make an immediate judgment on as the reader. And then I like to force you to revise that judgment. And like Holland was my first one of those, where he starts as a villain and then he becomes an antagonist and then he becomes a protagonist. And so, like, forcing you as the reader to reevaluate your stance. Another example would be Eli Ever in the villains books.
Mhm.
And it was such a fun challenge because there's 2 books so far, there's going to be a third. And in Vicious, it's really easy to hate Eli because you're given Victor's backstory, but you're not given Eli's. So the less you know about a character, the easier it is to judge them. And then you can like, so you basically start with them on a superficial level, get the reader to make a snap decision about them, and then you start adding depth to the character, adding backstory, adding trauma, adding a lot of humanizing aspects, and it starts to undermine the reader's judgment and relationship. And I remember after I wrote Vicious and everyone hated Eli, and I was like, great, so my goal for Vengeful is to make you understand him. And everyone at the time was like, no, it's not going to happen. Like, you know, black and white, good and evil, like I'm never gonna understand Eli. And then I was like, challenge accepted. And then that became like one of my challenges because of course, like the more we know about somebody, the more we empathize with them. And I think
Mhm.
my goal is never to write people that you can't in some way understand.
Yeah. Someone just asked, how do you know if your book is going to be for a younger or older public?
That's such a good question. I don't. I wish I was better at this. You'll get a lot of YA authors who will be like, I write YA because I feel like I'm still in high school. Like I couldn't get out of high school fast enough. I was like not a happy kid. It's harder now. Sometimes it's clear. It's clear in the kind of story I want to tell, and sometimes it's not. So earlier I called Gallant my first all ages read. And that was actually a really conscientious decision. You know, I've written middle grade. I have like Cassidy Blake, and you know she's like a precocious 11-year-old 12-year-old who has a specific kind of adventure, and like it's very family oriented and it's very like personal identity oriented, it's very friendship oriented, these themes and motifs which are really grounded in middle grade. I have like the Savage Song and Our Dark Duet, the Monsters of Verity books, which are about alienation and finding your place in the world. So finding your place in your family, finding your place in your world. That's like one of the big differences between like middle grade and YA themes. And it's dark and it's very angsty and it is very much who I was at 17. You have Addie LaRue, which is like who I was at 30. And so like a lot of times I'm writing to a version of myself. And like I say, sometimes I know based on the kind of story I want to tell
Mhm.
who the best protagonist is for it. But I came to Gallant. Olivia's 14, which is a very unusual age for a protagonist because it kind of falls in the liminal space between middle grade and YA. There are middle grade themes to it, there are YA themes, and there are adult themes. And in fact, you know, I went to my editor early on in the process and I basically said, I don't know what this book is. Because as I was plotting, I would come to a fork in the road of story and I would see, okay, if I go left, I can make this concretely YA. And if I go right, it's going to stay strange. Or I would come to another road. Okay, if I do this, it's going to feel more middle grade. And every time, what I wanted to do was take the decision, the road that was better for the story than the bracket. I didn't want, so like, for instance, a great example of it, there's a character in Gallant called the Master of the House. He is the villain. He is on the other side of the wall. And there's definitely was a road that I came to early on, and this is not spoilering, a road that I came to early on where I thought, okay, if this is a YA novel, the Master of the House should manifest as like a sexy teenage boy. Like he's not, he's like an ancient being, but I could manifest him in a way that he looks like a 17-year-old, you know, very fey, and I was like, that's definitely going to take it towards a commercial YA space. And then this is going to become like, there's going to be like a sexy tension. I was like, I don't want that, because like where Olivia is at in her life, she wants a family. And I wanted to take him to like a patriarchal space, to like a parental space. And so it was things like that. I would find these spaces, and I've written enough books now that I understand where kind of like the frames are, and you do enough reading within these categories and you understand where the frames are. And I just didn't want the frames. And so it was probably one of the biggest luxuries of Addie LaRue's success that I was able to go to my editor and basically be like, can I just tell the story I want to tell, even though it's going to probably be less commercial, because it's not going to be cleanly fitting into a category. It's going to be in that in-between space. And my editor said to me, like, tell the story you want to tell and your readers will be happy. We'll market it. You know, we'll find the readers. And that was probably the greatest liberty I've ever had. So that's a deeply unhelpful answer, which is to say that, like, you know, if you want to write something and you're trying to figure out where it sits, start to look at what is the purpose of the story you're telling? Like, what kind of identity narrative is it? Is it about somebody finding their place in the world? Is it about somebody finding like their self or their family? Or, you know, what is the conflict? And I think oftentimes the nature of the conflict will help you understand where that story sits best.
I love how you explained that, because after I read Gallant, I was like, what age group is this?
Yeah.
And
I mean,
like, yeah.
The goal is, here's what I'll tell you. This is the other thing about it. I did a ton of events over the last 5 years. All right. Obviously, the last 2.5 years, a lot of it's been virtual. But before that, I would do these book festivals really as in the wake of Shades of Magic and Vicious and Vengeful. I do these book festivals, and my line, my signing line would look so different from everyone else's. I would literally have like a 60-year-old woman and a 10-year-old boy and an 85-year-old man and the couple, and all these people would come through my line, and the books that they would bring me to sign almost never lined up with their presenting identity. Like, I had this boy come up to me at a Texas book festival. He was 10. He was with his dad. He was 10. And he goes, "You're my favorite author." And he hands out his book, and I'm expecting it to be City of Ghosts. And it was Vicious.
Ooh.
And like stuff like that kept happening. And what I realized is books don't have an expiration date, right? We come to stories at different times in our life, and we will experience the same stories in vastly different ways, depending on where we are in our own lives. So I didn't want to write a book that was prescribed middle grade or YA or adult, because I think a 10-year-old picks up this book, a 20-year-old picks up this book, and a 70-year-old picks up this book, and they all experience it in completely different ways, but hopefully they all enjoy it. And that's the thing that I found is, like, my readers were reading beyond the boundaries of where the book sat in the bookstore anyway. So this book just essentially ignored the boundaries entirely. So I guess that's also super unhelpful. But it's just to say, like, I've noticed in the past few years that, like, you know, you're just going to discover books, and you're going to discover them when you need them, or you're going to discover them when you don't need them, and you'll come back to them at a later date. And I think sometimes I know how essential it is to make sure that books are in categories so that readers can find them. But sometimes it's nice to have a book that can transcend those categories and fit into the liminal spaces between them as well.
Yes, definitely. And I think it's also just good, like, even, you know, when we have yearbooks at a library and people ask, oh, I want a book for my child who reads this, or they're in this grade. But it's like, you know, what kind of books does your child read?
Exactly.
Is usually the first question we ask, because we base it off of that and not, you know, their grade or like their age.
Here's the thing. My dad is 73, right? He became a reader when he retired at 69. He was like in tech. He like never had time. He never read for pleasure. So he's basically just been a precocious reader for the last 4 years. And I have to do the exact same thing that you do with your kids at the library, where I have to ask like what he's in the mood for, like what kind of, I have to suss it out. Like it's never about like it's not an age thing as much as it's a style, it's a design. There's a reason that my middle grade books are my scariest books, because kids are like much braver than adults when it comes to things like death. Like people are always like, are you going to write horror for adults since you write it for kids? And I'm like, no, like adults, why I feel like at 34, I'm like craving a blanket. I'm not craving like a ghost story. Like kids are so much more precocious. And I also think that like, it's so powerful when you write and you know that you have I don't want to say write for young audiences, when you know you have young readers, because it's really an age where you're discovering the sheer power of like holding a story in your hands, both the ability to pick it up and the ability to put it down when it's not for you. And like, that's an incredible act of agency that we have to foster in kids, to like let them decide for themselves what's beyond their reading, what's, you know, what they want, what they need to see. I write a lot about death as like a porous boundary, as a two-way street, as like a foe. And I do that because like as a kid, I was obsessed with death, and it made me feel really odd and alone to be obsessed with death. And so I write stories so that if any other young readers read my books, they'll understand that they're not alone to like have these interests, right? We shouldn't be hiding it from them. That makes it feel like a taboo subject. I'm like, but it doesn't stop the fact that like kids have to face dark things in the world.
Yeah, for sure. But I think that's what I love about your Cassidy Blake series is it doesn't matter that she's so young. She can go into these, you know, basically walk the portal between like life and death.
Yeah. It's a dark power. Like I ask adult readers all the time, like, would you want to have Cassidy's power? And they're like, no, absolutely not. And I ask kids and I'm like, would you like to have Cassidy's power? And every kid is like, yeah, obviously. So that tells you everything you need to know.
Yeah. We have a really great question about what inspires you the most. Have you ever gone to a museum and seen a painting that made you want to write or give you an idea?
Look, I love this question because yes, I am inspired. So, okay, first rule, again, I'm going to come back to a metaphor, but it's going to be one we haven't used yet. Like people always ask where I get my ideas from, as if an idea is a single thing. But for me, an idea is like the ingredients in a meal. And like I spend a lot of time, sometimes months, sometimes years, collecting the ingredients to figure out what meal I'm preparing. So every piece of inspiration I take is not the meal, it's like one ingredient in the meal. So like yes, I can get ideas from reading. There can be like one thing a character says in one novel, which will like stick in my head, and then I'll ask myself a question based on it. But more often than not, the ingredients in my meals are songs, works of art, like vistas, like places I go. But like really, I wrote an entire book that was largely inspired by a dance on So You Think You Can Dance. Early in the early years of So You Think You Can Dance, there was an addiction song. There was like an addiction dance number. You can still find it if you go onto YouTube and you like type in So You Think You Can Dance addiction. And that largely inspired The Archived, which was one of my first books. And that whole thing came from like the toxic relationship in The Archive is between Mackenzie Bishop and Owen Chris Clark. And that relationship was inspired by that song. I am like huge swaths. I have like an entire character in an upcoming novel inspired by Florence Welch from Florence and the Machine. I will constantly save artwork into my Instagram that is just like pieces that make me want to make art. One of the reasons I actually blame a work of art for why Gallant took so long, because I found this work of art at a Comic-Con. I became absolutely enamored with it. It is like a face, and then the top half of the face essentially goes into shadow, and then it goes into gilded horns, right? Ooh. And I thought for the longest time that Gallant was a fairy tale. And I thought, there's a locked door in a garden wall. And for 4 years, I kept thinking that the space beyond that wall, the thing that the door led to, was a fairy tale. So we're leading into a forest, into a fey space, inspired by that work of art that I thought had to be. And then it took me like 4 years to realize that I wasn't telling a fairy tale, I was telling an underworld tale. And that piece of artwork did not work for me anymore. I had to hold on to it. But for like, that's the kind of thing where I'll get inspired by that. I'll get inspired by a single frame or by a movie, a moment in a movie. All of those things become ingredients in the meal. So I am like a voracious consumer. You can tell the light keeps changing on me because I have my TV on and it's doing like the Netflix hold screen. But I'm, I read probably 150 books a year, but I'm all like, honestly, that's a craft inspiration that helps like hone voice and understand, like feed that internal story monster that tells you when something works and something doesn't, which is like your intuitive sense of story rightness. That you'll start to hone it and it'll tell you this story has too many beats or this scene isn't quite flowing. But honestly, most of my ideas and what if questions are inspired by songs, music videos, pictures on Instagram. Like you just never know where the inspiration is going to come from.
Wow, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Since you mentioned you read so much, can you tell us about some new authors that you've been reading?
Okay, there's a debut author. It's not even, you know what it is? I think that the cover is not good for the book. The cover's a fine cover, but the cover looks like a rom-com and the book is not. I love rom-coms as well. Like Emily Henry's newest Book Lovers is so delightful. Everything Emily Henry writes is delightful. Before it was The People We Meet on Vacation. But this book is called Lessons in Chemistry. And it is so good. Like I can't even describe it. It literally is about like a struggling female chemist and her daughter and her dog, whose name's 630 because that's when they found him. And he like definitely has a point of view in the book. And it's so beautiful. I think I'm going to be thinking about it for years. Like it really took me by surprise. I kind of just picked it up thinking that it would just kind of like be something I would devour in a day, like very candy. And I found it so moving. How I can tell it was good is because I gave it to my dad, who's like the really difficult reader. Before that, on the middle grade side, I love this series called Nevermore by Jessica Townsend. They're like among my favorites. And I just read the third book, which is called Hollowpox. And they're like such delightful, I always say like really nice Harry Potter alternatives, because it's essentially like, what if a girl was kind of destined to become the next Voldemort, and like, what would she do? It's so good. I really recommend them to everyone. And then I read a thriller called Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby that was also phenomenal.
Wow. I bet everyone
also,
is adding
here's the
all
last
those.
one. I read a poetry collection by Kate Bayer. And it was, oh God, hold on. I can't remember the title, but basically it was such a brilliant collection. She did whiteout poetry. So like blackout poetry, like Victor's poems. And she did poems and she used as the material comments and emails that had been sent to her over the years. And
Wow.
the collection is called I Hope This Finds You Well. And it was absolutely phenomenal.
That is very creative.
Yeah.
Let's see, since we've only got a little bit of time left, someone asked, oh, this is a good one. What is your favorite comfort book?
Ooh, okay. This is where the pitchforks come out, right? I don't reread ever. I never reread books. And so I don't have a comfort book because like, I think it's that I get really scared that there's not enough life for me to even read all the books I want to read that I haven't read yet. So I never let myself stop and have a comfort reread. Like it's so silly too. Like I'll rewatch movies, I'll rewatch whole TV shows, but it's like, I'm not worried about running out of like time for those. But I'm just like, I look at my to read shelf and I feel so overwhelmed all the time that I never reread. So I don't have comfort rereads. I'd say the closest that I come is having like series that I'm excited to continue because I really like the characters. And so the next book in the series becomes the closest thing I have to like a comfort read because, yeah, someone just said it feels very Henry. Henry Strauss in The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue is based on myself. So Henry is, I like to say Henry is who I would be if I'd never found writing. Like he's essentially autobiographical character of me, for better or for worse. So yes, I'm glad that it sounds very Henry. But no, the closest thing is I'm rereading Count of Monte Cristo right now because there's a storyline in one of my upcoming Threads of Power books that has an element from Count of Monte Cristo, like a Count of Monte Cristo in Red London. And so I'm rereading that, but I think that's like one of the first books I've ever reread.
Oh, wow.
I know, I'm a monster.
No, you're not.
I feel very, very self-conscious about it. But again, it's because like my to-read pile is too daunting.
And books keep coming out. It never ends.
I know, I can't keep up. And I read so fast and I still can't keep up.
Can you tell us about which one of your books has been the most enjoyable to write?
Ooh, probably Vicious. The reason being that I wrote Vicious early on in my career and I wrote it entirely in secret while my early career was falling apart. So I'd written 3 novels and none of them had done well, and my publisher dropped me, and I was basically being told that it was my fault that the books weren't selling, that it was like my problem. And I was 25 and I was about to quit publishing, which tells you something. And I basically decided I'm going to write one more book. It's going to be the book I want to write. I don't care if anyone else reads it. I'm writing for an audience of one. I'm going to make it as weird as I want it to be. I wrote it for 3 years and I didn't tell anyone that I had written it until I was done writing it. So the whole time I was writing it, it was literally just for myself. And because of that, I didn't pull any punches, and I just like let it be weird. And then that would be the book that would kind of salvage my career. And I say salvage because it's not like Vicious came out and was like an overnight bestseller. Vicious has never hit a bestseller list. Like, it has just sold really steadily since it first came out, but it gave me like a new foothold. And also it taught me probably the most important lesson of publishing, which is that you cannot control success and failure. Like, those are marketing things. Those are monetary things. The only thing that you can do is write a book that you are insanely excited to read, because you are the first audience and you are the first champion. And that way, no matter what happens with the book after you finish writing it, you won't feel like you wasted your time. You'll feel like you wasted your time if you tried to write to an invisible audience. But if you write to an audience of one, that's yourself, then you never really are in danger of wasting your time.
That's such great advice. So sadly, we only have 2 minutes left, but before we go, would you like to give a little blurb about what First Kill is?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So First Kill is my first ever TV show, and it comes out June 10th on Netflix. It is based on a short story of the same name, First Kill, which is in the anthology Vampires Never Get Old. And essentially, it is about a teenage girl vampire named Juliet who needs to make her first kill in order to fully access her vampire self. And she has a crush on a new girl at her school named Calliope, and she decides that Calliope is going to be her first kill because it's better if you like them. And she and Calliope end up at a house party together. And she goes to bite Calliope, and Calliope goes to stake her in the heart. And it turns out that her new crush is a monster hunter who needs to make her own first kill in order to be accepted by her family as a proper hunter. And so it's just star-crossed lovers. You know what? It's campy and it's weird and it's fun, and it's like what I wish I'd had when I was a teenager, because I jokingly say if I'd had it, it wouldn't have taken me to 27 to come out. But it's just I just really want it to be fun, and I hope people enjoy it.
Yeah, it sounds so exciting.
Yeah.
All right.
Amazing.
Thank you, Victoria, for joining us today and telling us all about Gallant and your other works. It's been so amazing talking to you. And thank you, everyone who joined us today from all over the world.
No.
Yeah. We hope you check out San Mateo County Library's upcoming author talks at smcl.org/author talks. And we would also appreciate it if you could tell us how SMCL did with this program at smcl.org/rate this event. We all hope you have a good afternoon. And thank you again, Victoria Schwab. It's been so amazing talking to you.
Thank you so much for the conversation, and thank you everyone for coming and hanging out.